Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today, we have a very special guest, John Spencer. I think everyone in Israel knows you already or knows about you or read some of your stuff in the past, I think since October 7th, for sure, but even before. So I'll just give the official title. John is the chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point. And since October 7th, like I said, I've written a lot of what you've been writing about and talking about urban warfare, because that's what we've been doing here. So John, it's a true pleasure and honor to speak with you.
Well, thanks for having me, and I really appreciate it.
So, John, before we start, can I just ask you in general, what makes a war urban warfare? Just as a general outline so we could then know what we're talking about.
Sure. So for my field of study and what I've been doing for over a decade is, urban battles or warfare, which is actually fighting. An urban war is where a majority of the fighting is going to happen in the urban terrain, which is defined by, man-made terrain, buildings and infrastructure, and a population that lives there. Unfortunately, for many reasons, the evolution of warfare has been drawn into cities where previously, to include even Israel, we fought for cities, but not in cities. But because of, the enemy always gets a vote, it's trying to pull people into cities. And I'm sure we'll talk about what Hamas built, which drives the fighting into the urban areas.
So one of the things that since October 7th, I think it seems to me there's sort of a disconnect between what Israel has to contend with and what the world seems to be expecting of Israel. So like you said, the wars of the past were very different than at least it seems to me, what people in the West perceive as what a war should be. So there's sort of like, maybe tell me just if you agree with me before we get into the nits, the bits and the nits of all this situation. Is there sort of like people, when they're looking from afar and they see children in Gaza, being displaced, or a building being knocked down because there's a tunnel under it, or a hospital being, the soldiers entering a hospital and taking out elderly and sick people and moving them out, there's a sort of misunderstanding of what's going on here, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, just in the ability for anybody around the world to have access to a war in real time, to see the images without context, without any historical, basically comparison. So they see and they think it's in comparison to what else. They don't understand the challenges, the uniqueness to it, the context to it, the laws. If we would have had this level of social media, ubiquitous technologies like cell phones and satellite imagery and all this stuff in previous wars, we can get into that war is a contest of wills to include those watching the wars, not even participating in it. It might have changed. So unfortunately for Israel, this came at a time where the world can see into wars unlike they've ever been able to before, without context, because they also have a heuristic of they know the wars in which they have lived through. So this gets to the problem where people view Israel's war in Gaza as some type of counterinsurgency, because Western militaries have been engaged in counterinsurgencies for 20, 30, 40 years. So the realm of what people believe Israel should be doing, or the realm of even possible given this scenario, is overshadowed by a lack of knowledge or what they've lived through, not a history.
Right. Do you think also just that the way the war is played out, moving aside the double standard a lot of people have for Israel, the fact that the terrorists that are fighting Israel, the insurgents, so to speak, the terrorists fighting underground, using civilian places to sort of use it as a propaganda. You're basically forcing the Western army to bomb a hospital in order so that you could use the dead people under the hospital to try to beat them in the PR war. Does that mean that from now on, all terrorist groups will use this as a model to sort of, we can't beat you fighter to fighter because the West's armies are much stronger than us. So we'll bait you into, killing a lot of civilians or even if you don't kill them, but a lot of civilians will be filmed dying. And that in and of itself makes the Western army, the Western country that's fighting the war, lose the battle in the, the diplomatic sphere.
So I hope not. So this is why I'm so vocal and why I've written so much about the fact that we can't let, which is not, I don't call it a double standard. It is the Israel standard, as in Israel in its previous wars not allowed to win, fight to a draw.
Right.
The standards in which people believe Israel should be fighting are not the standards that even Western militaries that follow the law of war are held to, or the same questions are asked. I'm sure we'll get into that. Like, nobody's ever asked what your civilian to combatant ratio is. And that's the number one data bit that people believe is the sole determinant of whether either side is following a just war, justly, or anything. But, this aspect of, PR war, I mean, all war is a contest of will. So I can't, I'm not a historian, but I have a lot of historians that will point out, like, nothing's new. This was there, the reason that we run marathon is because a guy was running back from a battle to explain what happened in the battle. So information and the spread of information has always been a part of war, and the perception of a war, like, the U.S. defeat in Vietnam, was because the American population gained from a reporter that it was basically hopeless to achieve the goals that we had said we wanted to achieve. But you also see, so that, Gaza is the culmination of all that has come before, to include Western militaries being defeated not on the battlefield but cognitively, right, in the minds of their populations, like, which was the first Battle of Fallujah, is a really good kind of minor butterfly echo of what happens in Gaza, where basically biased media, if not basically misinformation media, broadcast during a battle that there's lots of civilians being died, broadcast the children being harmed, because that's like a universal, for those who care, a universal thing nobody wants to see in the world for no reason. They don't care the justification, unless you're Hamas, of course, which we can talk about.
Right.
This is also the evolution of what's called lawfare. So that, after World War II, many of the laws of war were strengthened, many more protected objects like schools, hospitals, mosques, in populations like hospital staff, wounded personnel, media. All these things were the protections under the law of war were strengthened and evolved, which has led to people who want to use that to their advantage to do what's called lawfare, where they put all of their military facilities in these protected sites. I used to say before going to Gaza that Hamas, put tunnels under every hospital, school, you name it, UN facility. But I learned after visiting 3 times since October 7th that no, they put the tunnel first, the military tunnel there first, and then put the school on top of it to protect the tunnel. Mm-hmm. So it's an evolution of what's called lawfare. And Hamas then also, like you said, did that to, they never plan to fight the IDF. They know they can't defeat the IDF. They know they can't even hold out on like a guerrilla warfare. They have to defeat Israel in the minds of Israel's allies, to ostracize Israel, to not support Israel, to force Israel to stop, even though it's being attacked, which is historical as well. Hamas and others have learned from Israel's history as much as everybody else. But Hamas deployed this human sacrifice strategy to do that, which is very unique. As somebody who studies especially urban wars, I've never studied an enemy who doesn't just use human shields, which is putting their people in front of them so you can't attack. Their political military strategy, and they say this, I don't say this, requires the death of their population so the world will turn on Israel and do what has been a little done to Israel thus far, which is turn on it, not believe anything it says, want them to stop no matter the cost to their even survival, where you have Israel, which no nation should have to do, having to justify its survival.
You said it's very rare. Is in any of the wars or battles in the past that you've studied, has this ever happened in the sense that this is the strategy, getting as many of your own civilians to die so that the other side gets pressured by the international community?
No, not at all. Actually, like the first and second, like the Battle of Fallujah, which is a great example where the the insurgents are trying to use human shields, and they are trying to use in the information domain any death of civilians. The Nazis didn't do that. The Japanese didn't do that. Even though, like in the Battle of Manila, where the Japanese are occupying the Philippines, they don't care if that's not their population. So the Philippine population, they slaughtered. They didn't care. But I can't find an enemy, not Al Qaeda, not ISIS, nobody who not only says but also acts to get their population, their people killed in some warped ideology. So that's easy. No, I've never seen it.
One thing I want to ask you, our prime minister, I quoted you one time during the war, and he said that you said that Israel has implemented more precautionary measures to avoid harming civilians than any other army, far beyond what is required under the laws of war. So I guess my question is, could you maybe just expound on maybe what is required and what Israel has done far beyond what it needed to do?
Sure. And I interviewed the prime minister while I was there to include the head of the IDF and many other individuals. So I appreciate when he uses my research like that, because it is unique and the more people need to hear it. As somebody who studied urban war, I also am involved in a lot of human rights groups who want to, improve the protection of civilians in conflict, which is very important. But I've also known the history of what's called civilian harm mitigation measures. And that's what we're talking about. Things that militaries are required to do or have done even beyond those requirements to get civilians out of harm's way, or to do the laws of war like necessity and especially proportionality, which requires a military to assess each individual operation and strike based on the value of the military target, like how important it is to the mission, and then assess what the collateral damage or civilian harm will be, and then and this is really where these preventive measures come into it, any measure feasible or reasonable to limit civilian harm or take precaution. It's also called the law of precaution. And Israel did what most other militaries. So in the history of any like scenario where you have an enemy defender in an urban area who's trapping civilians inside the civilian area, most militaries, like the U.S. military in its past wars, will wait. They'll drop flyers and they'll try to establish safe evacuation zones, like streets and routes. They're called green zones or green routes, to safer areas outside of the combat area. But that dropping of flyers, basically broadcast on TV or radio, are about the extent that any military has ever done. Israel did that. So Israel waited after October 7th for weeks, dropping flyers and doing notifications. But Israel also has advanced technologies where it does the phone calls, the direct phone calls to the enemy's population saying, for your safety, please leave these areas. It's done text messages. It's done left voicemails. It's done roof knocking, which no military does, which is before it takes a strike, Israel will call everybody in the building and tell them, look, this is a military facility. We're about to engage it. Please leave for your safety. It gives a certain amount of time notification, which is required. And then it drops munitions on the roof. It's called roof knocking. All that is beyond what everybody's done before. As the war developed, though, Israel quickly started doing more than even the legal requirements. Israel started handing out its maps to the civilian populations so that the civilian population could know, even down to the single neighborhood area, this is a military operation. Please leave this area or stay away from this area. So right there, Israel did more than a legal requirement, which is to notify the civilian population of where they're going to be, which also notifies the enemy. So the IDF gave up a lot of their element of surprise. Beyond that, Israel has done call outs where it'll surround an area and then let all the civilians leave through them. So this is even beyond the notifications, beyond the legal requirements, to try to figure out a different way to get to the enemy who is hiding, trying to use the civilian population, using facial recognition to pick out Hamas in the evacuating personnel. This also applies to targeting. When Israel does targeting, that it will call off strikes. Once it does that proportionality assessment, It'll watch a target for days and if not longer to ensure it knows the pattern of life of when exactly to hit the enemy, which will lower the collateral damage. All these measures taken collectively are more than any military in the history of war and beyond the legal requirements.
So I know this is not your field, but you're a lot in the media and you've been talking a lot about this stuff. How do you explain then the disconnect between what people are seeing and saying and what is actually happening? And so like, I live next to the hospital here, so we've been hearing a lot of helicopters from the soldiers being taken here. But I guess my question is, it's so obvious what you're saying to anyone who really looks at the issue. You're not what you said now. Anyone who reads Israeli media and a lot of the Western media between the lines will know what you just said is true. And yet, when you're being interviewed on CNN, not too long ago I saw, and we're being interviewed on other places, the questions are so, it's like it seems obvious to them that what you're saying is not true. What you're saying is not what's happening. And that Israel is killing all these people willy-nilly just doing it. So maybe just, it's almost like a psychological question, but do you have any explanation for that?
I have some explanations. I can't explain all of them, right? So some of them are people like let's say a Mehdi Hassan who just deeply hates Israel as a nation, and he believes he knows who the aggressors and whatever. So there's those individuals, but from a mainstream media perspective, and if I didn't mention also the daily tactical pauses that Israel does, which it has been doing for hundreds of days, daily stopping the battle to allow civilians to evacuate. Historically, that's not required. Again, it goes beyond things. One of the reasons that this has been a challenge is because the mainstream media or active voices, which have some of them being in like human rights groups who have gained in power, and I've been watching that for over a decade. So groups like Human Rights Watch or the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights Watch within the United Nations or Amnesty International, Air Wars, all these groups who then become like trusted sources of information about war, although people don't understand their bias that they've said awful things about any military, to include the U.S. military, who are trying to tell the world that, this is wrong, or that there's another way, or the comparisons to unlike scenarios or the realm of possible. You got to factor in the ability for people to see, right? This is also what's called effects-based condemnation, where somebody will look at a destroyed city block that is in rubble and say, I don't care what you say, John Spencer, I can see from my eyes that's intentional destruction. One, that's not the way the law of war works. The law of war works, you have to do this assessment of proportionality, necessity, all these things with the information you have. It's never what is the effect of the operation. We judge the law of war on based what the commander, the information he had, the steps he took to limit collateral damage, and then the situation of the enemy as well. Same thing with the numbers, right? So where the number of civilian casualties for some reason became the overwhelming. John Spencer, I don't care what you said. How do you justify this many dead? Like, okay, that's really problematic. One is that there is no quantity that says like once you hit this number, then the war should just stop. If that was the case, then we would have more. This is why I'm so vocal, is if that was the case, if there was a number that says no matter what you're doing, and if I'm saying it, they're doing more than anybody's ever done in history, but somebody says, well, I don't care, but look at the number of dead. Well, who are dead? I don't personally grieve for murderous terrorists, and I don't think anybody else should. But the world has been convinced that it doesn't matter. It's only what they can see on their TV screens and the number, which is a lie that they've been given. So, of course, there's an anti-Semitism there too. Like, I have no other explanation as I've been assessing this war, because I've covered other wars. I was in Ukraine 4 times during that war. Nobody was asking these questions of what's your civilian to combatant ratio in defending yourself, or what is, what are all of these things were really unique as I was starting to report and cover and go into Gaza. The other, one of the reasons too is just people's access to the information. They're getting fed daily, hourly information from the terrorist group through so-called, stringer journalists or whatever. And they believe that those views are the right views. So it's a long list of how has the world gotten everything wrong about the IDF against Hamas in Gaza. And it overrides rational thinking, right? This is where emotion will override rational thinking and objective based data.
Hmm. I want to ask you about the tunnel warfare. So everybody's been talking about. I used to be in Golani now because I lost my eyesight, so I've been let out of reserves. But my friends who are there and people who've been there all say that they've never seen. Even the intelligence reports when you got there, it was so much more than everyone expected. Just the length and the complexity of the system and the amount of tunnels everywhere you went. Has there been a war? First of all, how do you assess Israel's fighting in the tunnels and destroying a lot of it, but obviously not everything because it's just, they say it's just too much to destroy it all. And also just in relation to other wars in the past, have there been other wars where the enemy has used such a complex or maybe something even less, but that you can compare it to of a tunnel system?
Sure. So since I also have been covering underground warfare and tunnels from ancient warfare to now, and I've been in Hezbollah tunnels before this war in the north and Hamas tunnels in the south, studying tunnels all around the world, North Korea tunnels in South Korea. No, there's been no military that I know of that has faced this complexity of underground factored into the war, right? Yeah, of course, there are places where wars have happened where there is great underground, even in Ukraine today and like Kyiv and Bakhmut and Soledar, but nothing where the enemy who is defending the terrain had built, up to 450 miles of military only infrastructure for the sole purpose of warfare at such great variety from just underneath buildings to over 200 feet underground for the purpose of also shielding themselves and getting their population killed. So this is where I try to say, somebody who studies underground warfare, all 2.2 million of the Gazans could fit in Hamas's tunnels in Gaza, but not one is allowed. But in other wars that I've seen, that has been where the civilians seek refuge from the fighting, let alone the attacking force. The nature of these tunnels, like you said, nobody knew the extent of the tunnels. And there are great varieties of tunnels from, tactical tunnels that connect buildings that maybe a company of Hamas would use versus ones that connect complete neighborhoods within Gaza where you can enter northern Gaza, as you know, and come out in Rafah. You could with the miles long tunnels that go underneath the Wadi Gaza, a level of investment over billions of dollars that people knew that Hamas was digging, but never, I think, failed to realize at what level or for what purposes. Even the previous operations like the 2021 Guardian of the Wilds operation, where we believe, or the IDF believe, they've destroyed like 60 miles of tunnels. Unlikely, but also the fact that there were 400 plus miles. And Hamas adapted to that ability as Israel has adapted its kind of action reaction ability to strike tunnels underground. Hamas then invested in more blast doors to negate that capability. So there have been other tunnels in other wars, like the Vietnam War, but even that, if you take up collectively, it was like 120 miles of tunnels. And there were parts of the Ho Chi Minh Trail that was underground, and you have the tunnels of Cu Chi, but nothing at this scale, like I have seen in Gaza, where you go to like Khan Yunis or Central, like in the Netzarim corridor now, and every step you take, there is likely a tunnel underneath you. Now, you talked about destroying the tunnels, as even us scholars before the war said, like, well, if you want to take Hamas's military capability, and you have to take their tunnels, you got to destroy their tunnels. And the IDF faced a challenge again that no military has faced, is like, well, how do you effectively destroy a tunnel, right? They tried flooding the tunnels, it didn't work. They have some liquid explosives that work, but there's just not enough. And now they string kind of anti-tank mines together. But as so the story of the tunnels in Gaza is also a story that I'm writing about, which is, a military adapting to tunnels to transforming themselves towards underground warfare, where Israel started with the Halom and Okets and other capabilities it was an obstacle. If you found a shaft, stop. Although they lost some soldiers in the beginning to booby trapped even outer tunnels. Hamas built the booby traps inside the tunnels. They actually poured the concrete with the bombs in the walls. So Israel was viewing it was slowing momentum. It was giving the initiative. So Hamas would just fight from the tunnel as long as they could, booby trap it and leave it. So Israel was having to slowly and methodically deal with what they found, even though they also realized that there are different types of tunnels, from these tactical tunnels to these more operational and even strategic, like headquarters and hostage holding tunnels, which is the other aspect too. This aspect of dealing with tunnels with the possibility of having hostages in them. Again, another unparalleled historical aspect of fighting underground. Israel, the IDF, and General Goldfuss in the 98th Division wanted to change that mindset of the tunnel being Hamas's terrain, and eventually developed a way to not only get into a tunnel before the enemy knows you're there, assess what type of tunnel it is, and use it in maneuvering against the enemy. So you have examples of maneuvering IDF forces on the surface and then maneuvering a force underground inside the tunnel before Hamas knows you're there, doing what we call maneuver warfare, overmatching. And that is, these are no longer enemy tunnels. These are maneuver corridors that IDF have gained a level of proficiency. They've transformed their own culture, because honestly, even the IDF had a culture of don't do it. Don't go in the tunnel unless at the last cost. Follow somebody if they're being kidnapped into it, but leave that to specially trained forces when the time is right. Now they've transformed themselves to, how can I use that tunnel to defeat what the enemy is trying to do?
So now I come to the question of the ratio between combatants and civilians. Everybody likes to quote you here about this specific issue. So maybe just explain to us, what is the ratio usually? I think that is the main issue, where in Iraq and in other places, the fight against ISIS, we like to talk about, I think, Mosul, which is a very Netanyahu likes to talk about that a lot, the battle against ISIS, where the ratio was like crazy as opposed to here. So what is the ratio here, and what is it usually in urban warfare?
So I always do this. I understand the question. I understand why you're asking it, but I have to say that I don't like the question. Because I don't want to ask of Israel, and I don't want to ask of other militaries, because it's never been asked before. There's never been a war or battle where somebody says, look, but I don't believe you. What's your civilian to combatant ratio? And that's going to tell me whether you're being legal, just, moral, or even effective in your operations. I don't like it, but okay, let's do this. If you forced me to do, okay, what's the civilian to combatant ratio? One is that there's never been a battle or a war where you can know the civilian or enemy deaths in real time. But for some reason, the Hamas Gaza Health Ministry has a magical system that can tell you within minutes how many civilians died during a strike or an operation, or even if it's not even an IDF operation. That's really problematic, because I don't want people thinking, usually, like in the Battle of Mosul that everybody wants to talk about, which we can talk about because it was the biggest urban battle since World War II for a few reasons. One, because the Iraqi government let ISIS hold the city for 2 years and prepare it for defense. So really, outside of these other comparisons that I could give you, like Fallujah and Away and all these other ones with American experiences, because I can't give you a foreign military like Russia, because they don't follow the laws of war. So when Russia eliminates 10% of the Chechen population in a matter of months, I can't give you the Battle of Grozny or Syrian wars where they kill tens of thousands a day, or 18 to 23 die a day for 10 years, but nobody, it's not Israel, so nobody cares. In that battle in Mosul, it was a year after the battle before they even started talking about what's the number of civilian casualties. A matter of fact, there's a PBS documentary a year afterwards, and they're asking, well, how many civilians died here? And they're like, 40,000. And that was from the actual Iraqi government on the ground. The United Nations and other groups started to drill down and settled on 10 to 11,000 civilians killed. There's actually no record, though, of how many combatants were killed. So I can tell you how many combatants were in the city during the battle, but I can't tell you how many. So I don't have a number. This is why I don't like the question, is because we know there are 3 to 5,000 fighters in this entire city of Mosul at any time of ISIS. So generally, I'll take the 5,000, the highest number, and compare it against the 10,000 civilian number that comes from the United Nations, which also is problematic because there are other people who say it's more. There may be somebody who says it's less, but that would be a 1 to 2, right? So 1 combatant, 2 civilians, or however you want to word it. And I can give you the same thing for the 2 battles of Fallujah. I can give you the same for World War II battles where they're physically trying to do anything possible to prevent civilian deaths, and it's way higher. So to say that there's a general number in urban warfare generally is this. In Gaza, which again, the problem here is that people want to compare it to like the Battle of Mosul, which is 1 city, 1 battle against a very small enemy. There are 10 cities in Gaza the size of major urban battles of the past. There are 24 total cities. So comparing a war to a battle is really problematic, but I'll do it for you. If I take Hamas Gaza Health Ministry numbers, which is so full of lies, it has double names, it has people that died of cancer years ago, there's just so many issues with this number. It doesn't recognize combatants, et cetera, et cetera. If I took their number, 42,000, compared it against the IDF's, because if I'm objective and I'm going to believe the word of a terrorist organization, by definition, then I should believe Israel as a government and IDF as a military, which say they killed around 21,000. That would be especially if we account for even the not even complete names on this list from the Gaza Health Ministry, it would be a 1-to-1 ratio, which is historically low for urban warfare. I can't tell you that it's the lowest in history because there is no battle that compares to what the IDF really, and people fail, in 2 ways. One way is in the size of the enemy, right? So that, Hamas was 40,000 plus, just Hamas. If you add in the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Lions Den, all the other terrorists, the number is immense. But the time that Hamas prepared for the battle, right? So this battle in Mosul, Iraq that happened in 2016 was awful because the enemy took 2 years building up its defenses, had a few tunnels between buildings, but nothing of the scale of Hamas. And Hamas prepared the cities of Gaza for over 15, if not 20 years for battle. So it's really hard to what's it historically? I can't, there's no other like case study to then say, here, let's compare the Battle of Gaza City alone to the Battle of Manila, to the Battle of Seoul, to the Battle of Mosul. So it's really problematic, but yes, it's historically low.
One last question maybe about just Gaza and specifically. We now have been hearing about a month ago, a few generals presented a new strategy called in Israel it got the nickname the Generals Strategy, where they recommended that Israel basically clear out the entire northern Gaza of civilians. Basically, the contention of the generals and the officers and the retired officers that wrote this was that what hurts Hamas the most is obviously not civilians dying or even Hamas members dying. What hurts it the most is losing control over territory and the population that's living, not the dying ones, getting discontent and wanting to go back home and pressuring the people, the Hamas leaders. And so nobody really did anything with it, but now it seems there's rumors that basically what they're doing now in Jabalia, Bet Hanun, and all these other places is that. So the Netanyahu told Blinken that he's not doing it, but let's, for argument's sake, say that they are doing it. Is that something that, first of all, is legal in the or in the lawfare, like you said, in international lawfare, and is that something that you would recommend as an expert in urban warfare?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've gotten a little bit, and I saw the general's plan when it was published. So I will caveat with I haven't seen the entire plan. I only have seen what's been published. I don't know what was briefed. I can say based on what was published that it's completely illegal. It violates international law. Siege warfare is not illegal per se. It is absolutely legal to.
Wait, I want to say, you said it's not legal or it is legal?
siege warfare is legal, so it's not illegal per se. It's how you do it that can make it illegal. You can
Uh-huh.
besiege an enemy and cut them off of all supplies. That nobody's taking that away from any military. But if there are civilians present in with the enemy, you cannot do that because you have to give access of those vital supplies to the civilians. The way the general's plan reads is that first you besiege it, you ask them to come out, ask the civilians to come out, and then you use the facial recognition, like I talked about, to pick up Hamas if they're trying to escape with the civilians. But it goes further and says that then give the civilians a certain window of, if you do not leave within this time frame, we will cut the supplies to you in that area. That is crossing the line into the illegal aspects of siege warfare, because you can never
Mm-hmm.
cut food, water, power, supplies to the civilians. And this would be doing it purposely, trying to change the behavior of the civilians, which most people who don't know about the general's plan is that they're talking about 300,000 plus Gazans who refused to leave initially. Like, there's nobody who has
Yeah.
repopulated northern Gaza. These are people in places like Jabalia who got the notifications, who got the phone calls, hundreds of them, and still said, I'm good, I'm going to stay. And are risking their lives and the lives of their family. But that's, unfortunately, so as a military strategist, I don't like generals who aren't in the the man in the arena giving advice to those that are, because there are many political constraints to military use of force, and there are some legal aspects here that if you're going to give a recommendation, it has to be feasible, it has to be suitable, acceptable. Like these criteria that we go, the general's plan, as to what I have heard, is illegal, so it's not even feasible. And what Israel is doing, I have seen in Jabalia right now, is not the general's plan. It is a operations, targeted area, evacuations, and they have Hamas surrendering, which is great, where they've done focused operations in areas which they kind of left alone based on the context at the moment, like Jabalia, after the strike that was criticized, which I personally believe was legal, in the Jabalia area against the Hamas brigade commander, where civilians unfortunately were that they were surrounding themselves were collateral, part of the casualties. But the general's plan, as I've seen it, is not legal, and it's not what I see them doing in Jabalia. But I hope that, and I believe confidently, after having been there, interviewed the prime minister, the head of the IDF, they are definitely cognizant of what the laws are, and like we said, they're following the laws of war and going beyond them.
Can I ask just a theoretical question? Let's just say hypothetically that those 300,000 people that refused to leave northern Gaza during the beginning of the war, let's just say everyone wouldn't leave. So let's say the IDF just leaflets and everything. This just came to me as you were speaking. So no one leaves. What does an army do if it wants to follow the law but also win the war?
Yeah, so I think Khan Yunis is a great example of that, because Khan Yunis was that during the temporary ceasefire, which brought many of the hostages home, which was great. Hamas forced Gazans into Khan Yunis, increased the population of Khan Yunis by 300%. Wasn't, for some reason, reported in mass media. So when the IDF went to clear this enemy stronghold, they had to figure out a way to, this is again with the maps, and they developed a way to track civilians in real time using their cell phones, whether they're on or off, and constrain the military to systematically. And this is where, this is what a military is forced to do, but it takes a long time. So it protracts the war and leads to, the Hamas information warfare working. Although on the ground, the IDF figured out a way to do these almost bite and hold, what we call it, where they take a small segment of that area, surround it, and then deal with it one piece at a time. And then tell the civilians which, if you have the IDF surrounding your building, you can do a call out, which is hopefully like a rational person says, okay, at this point I have to walk out. But it definitely does cause more risk to civilians when civilians refuse to leave.
Do you think that, in general, I'm talking to you, is that in these asymmetrical wars, where you have a Western army that is called on to follow all these rules that we've been talking about, and its enemy has no regard for the law rules and uses the rules against the Western power, do you think that maybe the rules should be changed? Meaning that maybe in these situations we should allow more leeway for armies to, because one of the things that you just mentioned is that it prolongs the war, and prolonging the war means that at the end of the day more civilians will probably be dead. Meaning, so in a way, taking all these precautions might be killing way more civilians than if some of these precautions weren't there. Am I? Was that
Yeah,
like?
no, I
Is that
understand.
a
I've gotten the
relevant?
question. Yeah, no, it's relevant. I've gotten it before, and I personally believe that no, um, the law is actually very clear and accounts for this. But it's been the mistranslation of the law that has been really problematic for Israel. Plus, war is political. The pursuit of political goals by other means. When we start creating standards of wars, which again, this is where I believe this is an Israel standard, where Israel is told the correct number of civilian casualties are 0, then that means the outside world with power is trying to tell Israel, like, look, I understand you were attacked, but you have to stop. That's the problem with the law, is when people misinterpret it to believe that 0 casualties is the goal. No, the law is very clear. It's like take all precaution to limit civilian casualties. And Israel, I don't even think that what Israel has done should be replicated in other areas, because it will protract. The way you defeat an enemy is through overwhelming force, speed, and surprise. When you do these, all that Israel has done, it has protracted. Plus, we haven't talked about the fact that Israel had to fight this war where another nation who could have saved thousands of lives, Egypt, refused, even though it signed refugee acts saying they would allow refugees, refused to let any of the civilians completely out of harm's way, which again is very unique to Israel, because I can't find other cases where the civilians were told, like, no, you have to stay in the battle area. There's nowhere for you to go. I believe the law is very clear. I just think we have a global problem with people understanding it. And this is what we've seen in these failing United Nations organizations who are political theater and try to convince people what the law actually says, like the law of hospitals, where the World Health Organization is saying hospitals are untouchable. Like, if hospitals are untouchable, then you are driving warfare into hospitals, because that's where the enemy will go. Like we saw Hamas, it's your fault. And Israel hasn't, even in that case, Israel has taken extreme care to protect hospitals, to surround them, do the call outs, search them, try to restore them to capacity, field hospitals, you name it. It's this weird mistranslation or weaponization, not even by the enemy, but by these other groups who have a history of also being anti-Semitic, but are just against any war for whatever reason.
2 more things on Gaza that I want to ask you, and then I'll just ask you about Lebanon, what's happening now. So my first question is, do you think, in retrospect, it was probably a mistake that they didn't start in Rafah?
So I don't personally say, I wouldn't say mistake. The delay, we can definitely say, but I also know enough about war and have studied that there is a lot happening at the strategic level. Because Israel, while it's fighting this war against this Hamas, trying to bring the hostages home as quickly as possible, is under attack by 6 other fronts, and having to make political strategies with the United States and Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and you name it, and trying to navigate this complexity. So in Rafah, I know that there was conversations with Egypt from the beginning to include the Egyptian military, although saying not one refugee, definitely launched, which is also beyond the kind of peace agreement with Israel. They launched a brigade plus of armor to the border to ensure nothing came out. So to say it was a mistake when they went in, of course, the world told Israel it could not go into Rafah. That was a mistake. Period. It protracted the war. Israel demonstrated that they could evacuate civilians safely to places where they could get the resources they needed, and the world told them not. So I think that was a really easy historical mistake, because they protracted the war. And when Israel did finally move into Rafah, they were vindicated that there was much more going on here. But to say it was a mistake, I wouldn't say so, because I know that there's lots of conversations even going on with Egypt and what Egypt did. I mean, they built like this 30-foot tower, the wall along the borders after October 7th, just to make sure nobody got out.
Mm-hmm. And plus, we know they're making a lot of money on every person that gets out needs to pay the Egyptian officers there at the border like $10,000 or something. It's a big money machine. The last question on Gaza is the prime minister yesterday or today in the Knesset was quoted. They asked him what is the strategy for the end of the war? When will we know that the war is finished? And his answer was very vague. It was like, we need to destroy the octopus's tentacles and this, which is all good and fine. But what do you think in terms of how do urban wars against terrorist groups end? When do we know that we defeated Hamas?
So that when you've defeated Hamas, when Hamas no longer has the hope of regaining political and military power in the Gaza Strip. Now, that's not an easy conversation to have, especially with even Israelis. So what would it take to make that happen? Yes, the Gaza Strip can be demilitarized. The most important tunnels can be destroyed. The Hamas military capabilities can be removed. But if Israel doesn't assist with in placing another power that prevents Hamas from regaining power, then the war will just be won by Hamas years, if not longer, from now. So,
yeah.
But holding Gaza in place, which is a different problem set than other areas, it's really hard. So the question that if I was a civilian, I would be asking, like, when do we transition to a different phase? But once you get into post-conflict phase where you can say, like, the enemy no longer has military or political power, it'll never have another shot at October 7th for sure. But if it maintains this political power, like we were talking about in northern Gaza, where they still have power over the people, they receive the humanitarian aid, hoard it, and then give it out as they want, charge extra prices for it. That next part of the phase, I don't call it the day after because that's really hard to put a day after, is a necessary component to ensure that there is victory, since the goals in Gaza have been very clear from day one: bring the hostages home, remove Hamas's military and political power from the Gaza Strip and never let them have it again, which is definable, and then prevent the Gaza Strip from ever gaining the capability to harm Israel again.
In terms of the hostages, and you brought it up, so I'll just ask shortly, isn't that a little bit of a contradictory what we want to do? Because if we get the hostages back, not militarily, so we're getting a deal with the organization that we're bent on destroying. So we're going to give them releasing prisoners. That's one of the things that the Americans and the Israelis are talking about. We're going to give them time to regroup because it's a ceasefire. So we're obviously going to get the hostages back, but we're giving them a lot that will take us back in the military aspect, right?
It definitely changes the timeline. I wouldn't say they're contradictory, and I also believe that none of the hostages would have been brought home only through negotiation and giving Hamas something, right? That's the history of Hamas. Right. You guys know that better than I do with Gilad Shalit and others. The idea that you could have just given them whatever they want, but the Israel's government and Israel's people that is the contradiction, is that I have to give them temporary things so I can return the hostages, the number one strategic importance, but without compromising the security of the entire 10 million residents of Israel, as in Hamas can't believe that they'll survive to continue. And what they say, they wanted to keep doing October 7th, keep taking hostages. You have to break that cycle by making sure that's a fundamental requirement, is that, look, I'll give you more time to live, whoever it is. Or and all these, giving them prisoners and things like that are all temporary means, but not giving away the security of Israel, saying, okay, we've degraded you. You can stay in Gaza Strip. We'll remove everybody out. That would be compromising the security of Israel for future generations, if not just in the short term.
I'm moving to Lebanon just quickly. What do you think? First of all, you said you were in the past in Hezbollah tunnels. So Hezbollah, what I remember, if I remember correctly, the ground in Lebanon is very different than the ground in Gaza. It's more rock, so it's harder to dig, I'm pretty sure. And it's I think their tunnel system is a lot less complex than the Hamas tunnel system. I think maybe also because they don't need to have such a big tunnel system, because they have bigger supplies of weapons and training that Hamas probably didn't have. So what do you think, in general, is the objective of the war right now in the north?
So with the tunnels, you're right. The geology is night and day. And why is there so many tunnels in Gaza? The geology plays into that. It's very easy to dig. You can dig with hand tools. You can dig with small power tools, although they did have a couple like Chinese boring machines. In southern Lebanon, rocky, they have to drill in the straight rock. And I have been in Hezbollah tunnels along the border. But they still offer, and they have invested, and it's called the land of tunnels. There are hundreds of kilometers of tunnels that Hezbollah has built in southern Lebanon for protective purposes, so that it can, the Israel Air Force is very powerful and can reach underground even. But this solid rock also makes them more protected. That's where they hide their capabilities. It's where they try to hold these defensive lines and hide their rockets. The uniqueness to Hamas is, with the strategy of getting as many people as killed, although Hezbollah does put tunnels underneath civilian structures to hide them. But unlike Gaza, many of the Lebanese people were able to quickly evacuate when told. So now you have, tunnel systems underneath civilian homes and everything. So it still looks bad from an information warfare perspective, but the purpose of the tunnels, the construction of the tunnels, the length of the tunnels, they have 45-mile-kilometer tunnels in southern Lebanon that connect entire regions to others. So there are lots of differences, but the goals of the war are different. So then what do you have to do with tunnels? It factors in if you know what the goals are, right? The goals in southern Lebanon for Israel are completely different than the maximalist goal of just removing Hamas's power and never letting them get it again. Israel hasn't said that that's what they want to do with Hezbollah because of how hard that would be due, since Hezbollah is embedded within the Lebanese government, society, everything. To eliminate that would be something that Israel couldn't even attempt to do. This is about terrain. And having visited northern Israel, as well as I'm sure you have and other listeners, that fact that you can see Hezbollah positions from the border of places they were never meant to be, that the UNIFIL mandate, the UN Security Council 1701, complete failure, like absurd failure, that the size of the Hezbollah forces in below the Litani River with a gun literally pointed at Israeli homes across the border is what Israel has to prevent, because their goal for the war is to repopulate northern Israel of the 60 to 100,000 right. Israelis. In order to do that, you have to do two things. You have to reestablish deterrence, as in where this rocket diplomacy can never be let happen again, where Hezbollah believes they can launch rockets and you can shoot most of this down. We're just doing it as a show of force for our people, that you can no longer allow that ping pong. So this is what, with the pager operation and the complete eradication of the entire Hezbollah leadership hierarchy has been a reestablishing of that deterrence on no more, never again, that level of acceptance is going to be there on the borders of Israel. But it's also a geographic for the people of Israel to move back into their homes in northern Israel. It has to be both an actual psychological belief of safety, but a physical belief of safety. So this is where Israel now has 7 divisions, as we're talking, deployed into southern Lebanon, clearing those massive tunnels and bunkers of their rocket supplies and their anti-tank guided munitions, everything, and to a certain geographic location. And then Israel will have that element of security, as well as a knowing that if you do it again, and it will not be this ping pong. So the goals of the war are vastly different.
So basically what you're saying is that, I'll edit this out, I just want to understand that I understand, is that the objective in Lebanon will end when we push Hezbollah back and we get, I guess at that point, to some sort of international deal, maybe a stronger UNIFIL or something of the sort that will keep them at bay, with Israel maintaining, this is what I read today, Netanyahu said, Israel wants to maintain in that deal that if they see any problems, they'll be able to go back in without, with American support, basically, for the deal. So I guess that is what you're saying, basically,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah. No longer. This is where the world changed on October 7th. Of course, Israel did as well. This reliance and this trust, but not even verify. In my world, you have trust but verify. So this was what was not done with the immense amount of Western money dumped into the United Nations and UNIFIL, is that trust but not verify and ignore the evidence in front of your face. But yeah, so reestablish this area without Hezbollah in it, and the deterrence that if you launch a rocket at Israel, it's going to be returned with extreme force.
Yeah. Two more questions. What in you're in West Point, you teach this stuff. What in since October 7th, the last year or so, will be taught in West Point, in American Military Academy, about urban warfare? And is there anything that you'll take for your courses from what's happening?
Yeah, I think absolutely one thing that will be taken, which I try to be as objective as possible, which we have learned and had to relearn, and Israel has had to as well, is that the use of force isn't as important as the perception of the use of force. And if you do not resource and invest in information operations, and communicate at the speed of current information, right? So just doing a weekly briefing is no longer good enough in war. You have to be communicating daily, hourly, operation-based to a wide variety of audiences. And if you don't resource that, it doesn't matter what you do on the battlefield. The U.S. have had to learn that in the past. Israel could have done a lot better in that, to be frank, along the war. But it's definitely something, as we teach this, war is a contest of will, how you can lose a war and win every battle. That whole concept of you can win every battle, but you can still lose a war. Information is a huge component of that. Social media is now a part of that. How you communicate with everybody has to be resourced as much as your fighting forces.
Lastly, I wrote down a question that I'm not sure you would maybe want to answer, or is in your things that you maybe are expert in, but I just think that it's something that is interesting. So in Israel, since the war, there's been basically an understanding that we're going to need to up the funding for the military. So we're going to, which is high anyway, but because of just the absolute threats and the cost of the war itself, but longer term, we're going to have to put a lot more of our GDP into a war percentage wise. In terms of Western militaries and Western countries, there's obviously debates politically about how high should a country, spend on its military. But what do you think in general, a citizen, someone like me, who's not a military expert, should know about what's happening here? I mean, you're not an Israeli. I am. So I'm sitting here talking to you. Do you think there's anything that we should be cognizant about? And how would you?
Yeah, so I would. So it's a great question, and actually, all countries do this. They believe in some type of peace dividend that they're in, and they start disinvesting, like taking money away from the military, believing in shared security and things like that. Israel is unique. Even in Israel wasn't doing that. It was still making giant decisions on the size of the mobilized force, the investments in technology, believing that you could reduce that force, the term of service, of mandatory service, things like that.
Right.
And I think Israel will come out of this understanding. And I believe that you cannot rely on others for your own security. And that includes in time and in your plans. And it takes, and for Israel specifically, it will take a very large investment, but people get complacent. Even in Israel, you could see that believing that there were a sense of security where the percentage of GDP and investment will have to be a lot more than it was.
John Spencer, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciate, just telling the truth. Like we said, it's not easy these days. So, when like I said at the beginning of CNN, I saw you talking to this, and it's like a disconnect between feelings and the pictures and the actual facts on the ground. So I thank you so much for doing it.
Oh, thank you so much. And you're right, but that won't stop me, even though it's hard.
Thank you so much.